Hi, team, and welcome to our first vodcast for the Roaring Twenties. We're going to be looking at the 1920s, which is also known as the Roaring Twenties or the Jazz Age. We're going to be looking at it thematically. There's so many cool things going on during this time period, so we're going to kind of categorize it and see if that will help us. So this is a thematic overview of different topics and then also some essential questions that you should be thinking about while you're listening to each of the podcasts. We're thinking about impact for each of these topics. What's the outcome? What changes are happening? How are things being influenced? Why do Americans want things to turn or change a certain way, different from what they've seen since World War One? So we're going to go through each of these topics individually, but this is just to kind of give you a map of where we're going throughout these vodcasts. So we're going to start with government influence, and each of the vodcasts that we'll be discussing will have a theme, and so that way it's easy for you to review and maybe pick up again if you were to need to before an assessment, or just to review because you love learning. So the question that we're thinking about here is, how did the government enforce change after World War I? What role does our government, whether it be local or federal, that's going to enforce or make changes that will impact the average American or the outcome of the United States? So the map that you're seeing on this slide is actually, maybe you want to wait for it to kick over, but it's going to show the changes of immigration, where different parts of our country, where people are coming from, where they've immigrated from. And you're going to see the differences between states and territories, getting as close as we can to present day. It doesn't obviously cover everything, but this is the best that I could find that gives us the most recent information in the 2000s. What I want us to think about is, how have we changed immigration over time? Where have we seen restrictions? Why have those restrictions been in place? Some of the ones that come out in the 1920s come from the National Origins Act of 1924 and the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924. We're actually going to end up combining those two acts to what's going to be known as the Immigration Act of 1924. We're going to be focusing on the number of people who are allowed into the United States. And it's going to be based on the national origins quota, basically what we know today as the census. 2% of each different ethnic group is going to be allowed into the country, but they're taking that information from 1890. So it's not going to be recent information from 1920 when they're making these decisions. They're making it from 30 years earlier. They're saying they're going to take 2% of the percentage of population that was there, 2% of that population is going to be allowed into the United States moving forward. They're really trying to exclude Asians as well. People from Asian nations are not going to be allowed to immigrate into the United States. A lot of that is going to come from the exposure that we've seen from the open door policy and the Treaty of Kanagawa. We know what their cultures are like. We know the changes they're making, and we don't want Asian cultures in the United States. Their competition, they usually come in as workers and they will work for low wages, and they're very hard workers as well, generally, if we were to look at stereotypes. And Americans find them to be too threatening and too much of a competition. Also, culturally, they're not from European nations, so the assimilation, the adaptation they have when they come to the United States can be a little bit more challenging for them as far as language, understanding culture within the US. So Americans don't want people from Asian nations here, obviously super racist. We won't start to see a change and really start easing up on the quotas or the restrictions on who's allowed to immigrate to the United States until 1952, and then eventually we will end all quotas in 1965. So it's fairly recently that we had quotas and expectations as to who was allowed to come in to the United States. So we'll watch this map in class and talk a little bit closer about it, but I just wanted to flash it a few times for you so that you could have an idea of where people were settling from the mid-1800s to the early 2000s. Another way that the government is playing a role in our society is amendments to our Constitution. While we are amending our Constitution, we also are going to see a development in a new form of crime. So it's a cause and effect here. That's why we have the arrow between the 18th Amendment and organized crime. The 18th Amendment is going to be banning not only the consumption of alcohol, but the creation, transportation, the sale of alcohol, completely wiped out of our society. Why do we need to ban alcohol? It starts with what's known as the temperance movement. And we talked about this very briefly when we looked at the progressive era. When we looked at some of those images, you saw the image of the woman being an angel and taking the child away from the big city, and it was surrounded by saloons. Alcohol is a problem in our society, and many women especially are blaming the societal issues that we're facing on the use of alcohol. Many of them are victims of domestic abuse. They're victims of lost wages because their husbands have gone off and they've spent that money while they're home taking care of kids. So they're looking to get rid of alcohol. They feel like if alcohol is out of our society, then we will be more productive citizens. It will end some of those domestic issues in our homes and hopefully then allow people to save more money because they can't spend it on alcohol. And so they're going to start by passing what's known as the Volstead Act. The Volstead Act is going to be the banning of alcohol. And then we find it's going to be so successful that we have a law in place that's going to ban alcohol that we're actually going to amend or change our Constitution by adding the 18th Amendment, which is going to be prohibition, right? Prohibition is no longer being able to consume, sell, transport, or purchase alcohol in any way. So it took 36 states in order to ratify that, and the United States became a dry country. I'm sure you know there town to town, there are dry towns where you're not allowed to sell alcohol. Maybe only restaurants, specific restaurants can have liquor licenses, but there now our country is dry, not allowed to have liquor anywhere. That's going to cause an increase in organized crime. What we're going to see is an economic opportunity for gangsters. Al Capone being the most famous in Chicago. But we're going to create something known as bootleggers. Bootleggers are people who are illegally creating alcohol for sale. And that sale is going to happen in what we call speakeasies. Speakeasies are going to be these underground kind of jazz clubs and just bars in general where people had to know codes or maybe had to answer questions in order to get into these bars because it was illegal for them to be consuming alcohol there. Kind of similar to what we're seeing today with the COVID speakeasies. If you were to go to Maine and go into Portland when you get older, there's a lot of actual speakeasies up there as well where they formatted them to look like bars from the 1920s. And they're actually pretty cool that you can go and you have to turn certain keys and know certain codes in order to get in. Some of the things that happen though because of bootlegging and because of these speakeasies is not only is it illegal for us to be consuming alcohol, but now we have competition amongst the people who are producing it illegally, right? Our bootleggers. So Al Capone is one of the most famous gangsters during this time in Chicago, and he has a rival. Bugs Moran is going to be his top rival in Chicago, and they are fighting over turf, right? They're fighting over who can sell alcohol, who can sell the most alcohol, where can they sell it. Al Capone is going to organize what's known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in February on Valentine's Day. Al Capone is going to send some of his members of his gang over to dress up as police officers and pretend to arrest people from Bugs Moran's gang. This is going to be a problem because, one, they're impersonating police officers, but they line up 7 people from Bugs Moran's gang and they just gun them down while their hands up against the wall and they are defenseless. They think that they're about to be arrested, but in reality, they are going to be murdered, right? They're going to be massacred. The goal was that he was going to send a message to Bugs Moran. He was going to make sure that they were killed and not going to compete with him any longer. So we're going to see an increase in crime now in the United States because of the use of alcohol. The other thing is that we finally realized because of prohibition that we're losing a lot of tax money. People purchasing alcohol illegally through the bootleggers or at speakeasies means that the United States and the federal government are not collecting tax money on it, which is a huge problem as we start getting into the Great Depression in the 1930s. So in 1933, we're going to repeal or overturn the 18th Amendment and add the 21st Amendment, which is going to allow alcohol back into the United States. All right. So we're going to stop here tonight. I hope that you have a great night.